Hello and welcome to Artifacts, a living archive dedicated to preserving the first-person stories of queer, avant-garde, and underground culture, told by those who lived it. Today's episode is part of Behind the Scenes, a series spotlighting the visionary arts administrators, curators, and cultural workers who shaped the ecosystems that made experimental art possible. Today we're honored to share our interview with Alanna Heiss, a pioneering curator and founder of PS1, whose radical reimagining of New York's abandoned spaces helped ignite the alternative art movement of the 1970s. From the clock tower to the groundbreaking Rooms exhibition, Heiss built the architecture, both literal and cultural, that allowed generations of experimental artists to thrive. This conversation offers a rare, first-hand account of her vision, her tenacity, and the birth of one of the most important institutions in contemporary art.
I was never a visual artist. I went to a conservatory of music. I asked my teacher what he thought my future was, and he said, well, obviously you know that in piano you would never be a performer. I was always an accompanist, which is another thing to discuss about preparation for curatorial activity. And I'm just a great accompanist. I accompanied my whole life, and one of the things that's a specialty that I did, which really was the best possible training, was I was an accompanist for a cappella choirs, which means you never play during performance. You're only a rehearsal pianist, and that's the lowest you can get as an accompanist, is to be a rehearsal pianist, because but you've got to be there. You put all the time in, but you're never on stage. And all you do is key people in, and the better they get, the less you play. So it's like the better that the performer is, the less you are visible or doing anything. That's really the top level of curatorial involvement, which is they're completely invisible, and you're out of the picture. I thought, I don't want to spend my life in Nova Scotia. I want to spend it other ways, and I want to spend it working with the real producing artists of my generation, whoever they are. And I can basically work with artists. I can work not as a rehearsal pianist. I can work as a kind of producer of some sort with the best artists of my generation. As I become involved in sorority and fraternity life, I loved it. And was at Kappa Alpha Theta, which was, the best sorority, and always had blonde girls. They were mostly blonde. I know that there are chapters in the United States where there were brunettes, but we never saw one. So we used to iron our page boy hair and flip our heads back and forth, and I was very proud of these pins that I wore that identified me. But the great thing about being a rush chairman in a sorority at that time was that it took away the gentleness that you might have had, and the feelings as a young person of kindness for other people. You had to believe that some people were better than others, and that your job was to pick and choose the very best. And you had to somehow believe that you'd been given this gift. Somebody had to have that ultimate director decision making, and they had responsibility. In all these ways, it helped form this strangely impossible idea that you could be a curator and choose the right artists. I had spent the end of the 60s in London. I lived there for about 5 years, from 66 on. And unlike young friends in the United States, who were, a lot of them, extremely and understandably preoccupied with the political situation, or extremely and understandably preoccupied with the drug and excessive shift in social arrangements. In England, that hadn't hit us yet. What had hit in England, which was remarkable and it was a tremendous amount of fun, with the swinging London aspect of what was going on. And this had really very, very little to do with art and a great deal to do with fashion and way of life. In trying to, as a foreigner, approach the issue of being a young person, making my way with a partner who is an artist and giving me access to a lot of very specialized information and energy and talent, I couldn't get a job, and in England the rule was that you couldn't take a job that any other English person wanted, which meant that I had 4 or 5 jobs at a time, and they were all exceptional and interesting. I was mistress of religious education in a girls' school in London. I was inspector of historic buildings and monuments, grade 2 for northwestern Scotland. I was a kind of rogue art critic for Country Life for contemporary art, of which there was no interest in contemporary art, for many of the readers in Country Life. So many, many more jobs that I had. Assistant to various artists who were working at the time, a liaison to the arts program in St. Catherine's Docks, which was run by Bridget Riley and Peter Sedgley, and put me right in the beating heart of London, of the studio problems which confronted all of British artists in London, which is a huge, vast city with a fairly good public transport system, but ending at 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night. Artists had a great deal of trouble seeing each other. Soho in London was not the really good place for the arts people to meet, because although it was very central, it was quite expensive and people didn't live. And people wanted to meet in pubs where they could actually walk to the pub, and then they could walk home at night. When Peter Sedgley, who is a painter, and Bridget Riley, who is also a painter and a great one, realized that they could put their hands on, through various connections, giant areas of the dockland, and one in particular called St. Catherine's Dock, which is right near the Tower. They decided that that would be a great answer for the British artists of the time. And they took kind of leases. These were not squatters. These were very official council leases on one of the largest of these warehouses, which had no running water and no heat, but other than that, of course, is perfect. And over 150 artists took studios or portions of studios in this giant complex, which was probably 500 or 600 years old. And I was the artist liaison. What that really meant was Bridget and Peter were busy in their own studios, and they didn't want to be bothered by people trying to find out information. So 2 things they did was, one, they gave me free lunch if I came there, and I would be the phone call connection for collectors or people who are trying to visit artists there and couldn't find them because there was no directory and no way to find them. And the second was that people were just trying to find out what was going on, other artists, so that I was that connection. The third thing that Peter and Bridget did was start a small cafe in the complex. I was already embedded in a world that I knew and understood quite well, and they saw me as a person who was enormously productive and hardworking, and in a very specific thing, which was making shows. And I didn't have any place to work. It wasn't a job. I mean, to make money near the end of my time in England, I became an extremely successful used car dealer. I love cars and horses. And cars, unlike horses, were very good for going to Europe and seeing all the shows. And so I got to see all the early shows that were being done by Conrad Fischer and Rolf Ricke and all the great German small museums that were doing the early shows of all the American minimalists. I saw all those shows, every one of them. I got to know Zeman, I got to know the whole Swiss system, I got to know these different systems of organization of shows. The most easily copied, but never was, system is the reverse of what we have here, which is the Germans who had remade their entire institutional structure after the war. The smaller museums, which were very important, there was always a Kunsthalle, there was a Kunstverein, and then frequently a Kunstmuseum. The Kunsthalle, in the smaller the city, was run by young, ambitious people. And the only way you could get up to a Kunsthalle in a bigger city was by doing remarkable shows of young artists. So the system meant that these adventurers were running around all around the world looking at art and grabbing artists who they could be the first person to show. Once that would happen, and they'd be there a couple of years, if they had recruited, it's like, I don't know, baseball players or something, they'd recruited enough young people, they'd get moved up or have the opportunity moving up into a medium structure with more power, bigger space, and more money. Now, you have to compare this with the complete opposite that we have here in the United States. We have a system where the smaller the place is, the less likely are you going to be able to organize a show that has even the slightest deviation from the norm. So you're running a place in a medium-sized city in the Middle West. Maybe every 3 years you'll be able to put stuff together so you can do some Matisse prints. They'd rather see a print than a painting. They'd rather see a print by someone that was made 203 years ago than anything made within the last 5 years. So the newer it is, the less valuable it is. The newer it is, the less a small place will take a chance. So you have the reverse of that in Germany, which is the smaller the place, the more they'll take the chances. So you have the age group of the museum people in Germany are very linked to the age group of the artists they're looking at. So they're going to have a more immediate understanding of the context anyway. We had to come home. Eventually Americans and Australians have to go home. So the main reason for coming home is to come to New York, which I just mentioned, the joy of New York as a show organizer, but the joy of New York of being an artist in New York is just unimaginable, because that's where you're surrounded by the people who are the most exciting people of your time, and your work is seen by them, and you see their work, and it's that conversation which, for I would say 80% of artists, producing artists, it's the conversation with other artists that make their work meaningful and their life meaningful. And the city that most people choose at that time, up until the internet, was New York City. Perfectly possible now with the internet to be anywhere, but primarily now you can be in Tokyo, you can be in, not Shanghai, but you can be in Beijing. You can't be anywhere in India, but you can be in London, and you can be in Paris, and you can be in Berlin. You can be in some variety of Swiss cities, and Rome is not possible, but you can be in Milano. A few people can be in Lisbon and talk to other people, but anyway, at that point, you really only had two choices. You had New York, and you could sort of be, if you were a very, very, very weird person, and you were an American, you could be in LA. And we came back to New York, and we entered a scene. We'd been coming every year just to see what was going on and try to understand what was happening in our nation, which is, of course, the most powerful nation in the world at that time, and all these extraordinary changes were taking place. We were trying to understand from our privileged London, don't do anything but have fun location, and entered into an enormously productive art scene that was around at the time. Pop was just starting to taper off, but its enthusiasm and joy was still there. Warhol was at his really prime. The minimalists were at their prime and their most productive, and we were all trying to make money in different ways, though not through business or commerce or teaching. I took my then partner, started with Phil Glass and with Richard Serra a little bit. They started a plumbing firm which did plumbing all over, so illegal plumbing. I was the estimator for that. But I always had a lot of jobs because I was always a straight person in every group. I was the person who didn't smoke dope, who had 1 or 2 or 3 jobs, blah, 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 and dealt with the straight world. People were very afraid of New York at that time, all through the 70s and certainly into the mid-80s. They were afraid because the television news reflected constant crime. There was this aura of danger that kept a lot of people out of New York and out of the stores and kept people from starting businesses there because there wasn't any money And there was no reason to do it other than they'd be running a club or a restaurant. All of New York at that time was very dark and very gloomy and quite wonderful and quite exciting because the whole activity tended to take place in the evening or all night. The buildings themselves were empty, and I became more and more attracted to the extraordinary abandoned feeling of the city. And the museums became less interesting to me. They weren't chomping at the bit anyway, saying, oh, please come and be our special curator in charge of whatever. It finally started to become clear to me that it wasn't just that they didn't have the room or the space to show this work. They really didn't want to show the work. They actually, most of them didn't like the work. What I did was I thought, I will grab empty spaces temporarily, use them for one show or a bunch of shows, drop them, and then go on to the next. So I intentionally went after a space owned by a building owned by private people that had been left vacant, a building owned by the federal government, that was the clock tower. Then in the next line was the city government, and I realized the city government is like this huge octopus. You can't do anything. It's Dickensian or Proustian. It's beyond comprehension. You have to learn the codes for each department of the city, and the departments that interested me were, of course, the Department of Real Estate, which held power or ownership over a lot of the city buildings, and the Department of Planning and Development. So, for instance, the Coney Island Sculpture Museum, aka the Coney Island Museum, was a product of that. It was a completely demented idea, which I wouldn't have done if I was just doing buildings in general for art purposes, but I wanted to do something with housing and development planning. And our Coney Island Sculpture Museum was on an abandoned street on the banks of the Cropsey Canal. Not so pleasant waterway, which was featured by NBC, I believe it was, on their episode series called America's Most Polluted Waterways. And Cropsey Creek was full of trash, and very often, like once a month or so, a dead body would be floating down, because this was really the dregs of New York. It wasn't even Manhattan, it was way out in Coney Island. And across the street from the big warehouse that we had gotten was Bruno the Elder and Bruno the Younger, who were heads of this giant trash and trashed car lot and other things. And they, of course, were regional operative managers for the mob. They had probably been responsible for driving out the owners of the Coney Island Sculpture Museum who had left, and thus allowed me to take it on because it had been abandoned, because some early bombs had been set off in this building, which discouraged those owners. But up the street were a few other minor businesses who moved out while we were there. And I went to them and I said, this is what we do, and we'd like to take it on for about a year, maybe 2 years. Will you give us permission to be your neighbors across the street? And they asked lots of sensible questions, like how much activity will there be? What kind of people will come? Will we have any problems with the police? And that sort of thing. And I said, I answered those questions as one could very easily. The artists will come, they will have trucks, they'll take care of themselves. No one else will come because people don't like this kind of art, and they're not going to come here, And what we'll do is, once every artist is left, we'll have a big opening, and it'll be outside, and you can come too. And and as far as the police, we need you to police this. The police will not police it, so we need you. And I'd like a little money from you. And a lot of these folks that I dealt with that were Italians, and I keep mentioning them all because they were often working in the 70s and the 80s in areas that I was working in. They often controlled these empty spots or buildings in terms of the policing element. We did that for about a year at Coney Island, and it was, really a pretty big success. The place had a fantastic, it was no columns, huge area, cement floor, everything you want, including these sliding cranes. And so a lot of work was made there, and then the artist would have it for a month or so, and then we'd do a show, and then work would go out, and another artist would come in. In the 50s and 60s, what artists did was they had artist co-op galleries. A lot of the co-op galleries are run by people who are ambitious, yes, but this is at that time. They were involved with good works, you know. They're going to run a good place, they're all going to contribute to the rent, and they're going to share the work. That's important to co-op galleries. Share the duties of guarding, and you know, and of course every artist will put up their own work, because that's what we do. So I kind of hate good works and social work and all that. And in my places, it was absolute rule: no artist would ever guard the show, no artist would ever pay for the invite. What we did was we did all the mailing, the promotion. We took care of the space, cleaned it, lit it, opened it up, and guarded it. Now, there is no question at those years, those first 10 years, of putting up the show, because not only did I not have the staff, but all these works could really only mostly be put up by the artists anyway. So there wasn't a big issue like who puts up the show. So those are the kind of deals that were for all spaces regular, and they were very different from the whole issue of co-op galleries. And I wanted them to be different, and they were different. So the first person it has to be right for is the artist. The second person it has to be right for is, for whatever reason I have back in my squirrely brain, for me. These reasons were not devoted to alternative space concepts. I mean, that was something that sort of emerged later when the National Endowment was trying to get some money out to us, and Brian O'Doherty came up with the name alternative space because he was trying to think of a kind of quasi-respectable envelope that he could include us in, so that there could be a regular basis and a committee giving the money out. Semiotics told us that the proper way to approach art of that time was not by commenting on its volumetric capabilities, as in David Smith, but the questions that piece of sculpture or painting asked. What problem does it ask, and what problem does it solve? That's how you look at the painting. What problem does it ask? And so in terms of your working with spaces, I would say, what problems does this space allow? What problems of this artist? So that the time matches up. So the deal between me and the artist is only as good as is good for each person, and that we can both maintain our interest in it for that reason. And you know, so I wanted to do these shows. I wanted to show these people in spaces. The spaces that were available and interesting to me also were empty, or going to be empty, or something peculiar about it, like there had a crane ability, or it was right on the waterfront, or you know, there has to be something like that. First show I did was underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. And that was not with any space but the bridge. That was with the city of New York. It was disguised as, everything was disguised. It had to have another name or another purpose. That was disguised as a festival celebrating the birthday of the Brooklyn Bridge, which was the 88th birthday. Now, why any city official would agree that you needed a festival for the 88th birthday of the Brooklyn, it's just ludicrous. But the more ludicrous you make something, the easier people have dealing with it. When I was doing a piece that involved outdoor activity, the way to get permission, which is you have to get permission because the cops come and stop you. The trick to this is make it a film. You go to the Department of Films, you take out a permit, you're going to do filming on this and say, they're going to be extras. These are the actors, and you can describe them. You can even give their names because they're usually, and they'll be extras. Yeah. And then you can't name all the extras because they're hired that day. And then you have the trucks, the filmmakers, of which there are always a couple of people ready around holding cameras, and then more extras are the audience. That's it. So armed with those film permits, and the city gave those out like candy, because New York City was extremely interested in being in films. It made the city more realizable, I don't want to say livable. It made other people outside think that it wasn't so bad and people weren't getting killed all the time and, weren't getting robbed and all that. So the Brooklyn Bridge was a very large, 25 artists in it. Carl Andre was in it, Saul LeWitt was in it, and they all did pieces mostly underneath the bridge. And Phil Glass, who had never done an outdoor concert before. That was a family show. I bet it involved a lot of the 200 people that were in the art world here, and it involved a wonderful painter named Harriet Corman who tried to have a painting outdoors. It turns out that doesn't work. We used to try things out all the time to see what would happen. The clock tower was running fine, but I was still trying to develop the template for all these different buildings. I wanted a performance space. I wanted to play with performance and find out how that could work. What was happening is it was largely happening in the space in galleries between shows with Paul Cooper, with Sympathetic Dealers. It was happening at the kitchen, but that was primarily video. So from the city again, but from a different department, I got the top floor of Reed Street, and it was 10,000 square feet of interrelated buildings with columns. 6th floor walk-up, no toilet, a toilet but non-functional, and it's not the best place for public performance, certainly not on an ongoing basis. What is the loophole? The loophole is that the performance people are being very much shunted aside. They can't develop the big pieces they're doing because they don't have the space for any longer than 5 days. 7 days at La Mama Theater, whatever, So I thought, let's give them a month to develop the piece. Let's have the performance on one day only or one night only. This was a 12-month project. I had a 12-month agreement with the city, and so I knew right up to the last artist pretty much who was going to be there. It ended the chapter of all these spaces, except for the clock tower. And I did other projects, but I'd done almost every kind of ownership. But it turned out everybody was doing it anyway. I was blinded by my own success at this and said, what I should do is write a kind of model textbook on the different ways to work with different kinds of ownership of empty buildings. And I should do an example of each, but it could be available from many other cities in the United States which have similar structures and similar issues. So this is in this warped vision I had of myself of a leader of rejected spaces, rejected by the commercial capitalist world. Within 2 years of the clock tower, the New York State Council started its own space called Artist Space. I didn't need to do these anymore, and I wanted something very, very, very different. And I turned around and I thought, I'll keep the clock tower and I'll keep doing shows there, but I really want to challenge another situation. I thought, no, there's a new thing to challenge, and there's a new I'm the new gunfighter in town. Who's the sheriff? And the sheriffs, plural, were all running the museums. It was very clear to me that, it was time. It was time to move out of just running all these places in a deliberately haphazard way, in a deliberately temporary way. These alternative spaces had developed even into a chapter of the National Endowment. The city government was very friendly towards what was called decentralization, decentralizing various cultural resources. So the result of this was many discussions about how things didn't just have to only be in a museum. I had been, by that time, sort of offered, not begged, never begged, unfortunately never begged, but offered museum opportunities, but they weren't at the big three, MoMA, the Guggenheim, or the Whitney. They were always some, museum in the outskirts or something that needed a tremendous amount of help and didn't have any contemporary art program at all, but most importantly didn't want a contemporary art program. They just wanted people to come. So I wasn't interested in that anymore. I was interested in doing shows, and I was interested in doing shows with artists that I felt were going to be of international importance and impact. And they were showing many places in the rest of the world, and there was no reason why they shouldn't be shown in New York City where they lived. But they didn't have any of those shows because the museums were reluctant, probably not for moral reasons. They were reluctant because it's hard to move that quickly for museums, and they didn't want to engage in expensive, messy things, which very easily could be wrong. The secret to my huge, huge, huge space building success was that I had so much space that I could engage in all the messy, though not expensive things, and half of them could be wrong, and half of them I would be really right. So one of the qualifications for the thing that I might do was that it be big. Each of the borough presidents had been told by someone that it would be good for them if they could get me to open a space in the borough. And in Manhattan, of course, there were all the museums, so that wasn't really, I thought, the greatest place to be. The police station was very interesting, but much too small, and there was an old age home on the Upper West Side, which I was not interested in. So then Brooklyn offered the Brooklyn Naval Yards, and that was really exciting. I spent about 2 months walking around the Brooklyn Naval Yards. But that was a curious thing. It was, you know, it's like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. That was too big. The whole place was too big, and there was no sense of there. There was no single place. You know, I could see the artists having, it'd be a great studio project, but not for this, what I envisioned to be this contemporary art space that would be identifiable. And you couldn't really see the water. And if you don't have a sense of the water in New York, you don't realize you're on an island. I had to have a place where you knew where you were, and when I went to see, and I didn't see it first, a very enthusiastic and terrific woman named Linda Bloomberg, who is also very politically connected, went out as one of the scouts, and she came back and she said, "Oh, Alanna, you got to get out there right away, because this is just something you're just never going to forget." So I went out there and I saw this school, which Brendan Gill, our chairman at that time and for 20 years, described as a post-Richardson building, and just a beautiful, the construction material was sort of a pink brickish, gone from red to pink. It was lovely, and it had been a double school because the mayor, the local mayor of Long Island City, had been a city before, had been so he'd been so in love with himself, and he was so sure that Long Island City would turn into be sort of like in Monaco, there'd be this small country, and then he would be the king. And anyway, he built not one school, but 2 schools, which were all sort of connected on a giant 2-city block area. Brendan once said that he felt that a different architect had been assigned to do the inside, and that they never spoke, because there were rooms that would go into rooms, and then they would go nowhere else, and we had to excavate and make new doors so that we opened up whole areas that had never been used before. Anyway, it's a mystery of architecture and ambition by builder and architect, and it was wonderful, and it had been the school for the entire community, for grade school and middle school for a long time, because those 2 were combined early on, and thus was the repository for all the memories of the locals. That was the place that Donald Maness was offering as one of the contenders. I didn't know Donald Maness. I knew who he was. He was probably the most famous of the borough presidents. He was certainly the most powerful. He was the Queens borough president, which really, really meant something then. And he was also the head of the Democratic Party, not only the Queens Democratic Party, but that gave him leverage in the Democratic Party of all of New York City and New York State. He had a very pivotal position. I mean, Donald wasn't an art lover, and he wasn't much interested in museums, and he wasn't particularly interested in church, or he was slightly more interested in sports. But he really believed that Queens had gotten the short shrift. That's hard to say, but Donald could say it. He said, yeah, the way people talk about Queens, they make fun of it, yeah. We got the airports, we got the highways, we got all the transport, and still. Anyway, he resisted the idea that it was only a bedroom community, and so he had various plans, but none of them very much matured. When we became a contender for this space, Donald was, he said, well, I guess I want to meet her. So that was me. So one of his henchmen took him over from the Board of Estimate to the 13th floor of the clock tower. And, he was not impressed. It was a lower court building, 12 floors of grungy courts and grungy people, mostly people that beat up their wives. And, that's a kind of bad-looking community, these guys in these bad clothes and their crying wives and all that. Anyway, so he was not impressed. But when he walked up to the 13th floor, he said, no elevator, no elevator. Gets up there, goes down this long thing and walks into this incredible space. He sees a show by Colette. And the picture he sees is actually mounted right over there in all of her glory. Now, it was a giant room, of course, all painted white. She'd built approximately a 20 by 30 foot bed structure, which was all lined by parachute silk, and there was a giant bed in it. The rest of the room was full of live birds chirping. She was completely naked. She had quite beautiful breasts and dark hair in her nether regions. And then she had this giant mirror on top of it reflecting her, so that if you, for some reason, missed out on the living woman, you were able to quite carefully examine the mirrored woman. He sees this, and she was very theatrical. She'd planned this out carefully so that you'd be knocked off your feet. And he was knocked off his feet. This is the kind of art we need in Queens. The only people who weren't so sure they wanted it in the beginning were the very small Italian community group who would preferred to see that it be like, Italian Craft Center or something like that. Before I took it on, though, and when I say I, Brendan and I did this together. He was the conspirator, the complete participant. There was no, I'll just sign my name and wish you well. That had been the beginning of his relationship. I'll sign my name and wish you well. Please do a lot of projects around the city. But by that time, we'd been running for about 5 years, and Brendan had gotten pretty interested in the kind of shows that were being done. He was mainly interested, because he was, among other things, a theater critic. He was interested in the energy that was both put out by the artist and put in by the audience. And we decided to keep the name PS1 and defy the museums in the world, because we were going to be so much better, that we were just going to be not a museum, not something else. We were just going to be PS1. And we had various words for the acronym of Public Spaces #1, and we fooled around with it for a long time. I wanted to find out who people had really done stuff would think of it. There was an architect named Dave Robinson, who was a big California collector. And he was very friendly, and he flew out to look at it. And he said, oh yes, this will be really tough. Maybe you should do it in sections. But he said you should do it, because we don't have anything like this in the United States. I've traveled all over the world looking at museums, because he was a museum builder. And he said, just don't have any building like this, and the rooms are the right size. You have to take it, because both inside and outside the light is perfect. It's filtered by the water, by the river, which is right so close to it that you don't get the same kind of dust that you get either in Manhattan or further out in Brooklyn or Queens. He said it's just perfect. And look, you have a huge part that's unused that you can use for storage and roll your trucks in. He said the artist can make a lot of the work, because it was all fenced, in there, and then you can just push it in. And he was very convincing. So I with great enthusiasm, went forward. I knew that I should probably eliminate a lot of things from consideration. One was water, keeping it out rather than having it. So the problem was going to be a toilet. But we just didn't deal with that for the first year. I moved into, during the day, the local diner across the street, which was called Tommy's Diner, and they had very good bathrooms. And Tommy was Greek, and he'd won the diner in a poker game about 6 or 7 years before, and he was not a Greek diner owner whose mission in life it was to run a diner. He wasn't so serious about it, and he didn't see it as a holy mission. So he said, sure. So I sort of rented a booth from him, and then eventually 2 booths from him, and put a phone in, and that was the office. That gave us phone connections, gave us electricity, it gave us a meeting place where there was heat, and it gave us bathrooms. One of the things that happened that was quite curious was that in carrying out the rubble, I called up Donald Mattis's office and I said, you know, we only have this amount of money. We have $150,000, a one-time grant from the New York State Council for the Arts that's co-funded by the city, and $150,000 for the year's programs. Now, I had already figured out that what I would do is I would put the 2 lumps together. I would invite approximately 100 artists, depending on how many rooms I could clear, and I would give each of them some money to make that room feasible for them to put up what their work would be. By feasible, I meant they didn't have to rebuild the room, but that room had to work for them with a certain minimal amount of adjustment. So there were a couple of rooms that were sort of long and big, and in those rooms, my conscience is speaking now because I've so often been said to have made artists renovate PS1. In those rooms, we did the walls because you don't expect painters to know how to do that. Anyway, but before they could even get in, the rubble had to be cleared. And I'd gotten a quote on the roof and a quote for the rubble, and the roof was going to be the main thing. We had to keep the water out. Remember, that was number 1. And that was going to cost about a third of what we had, $50,000. So I called up the office, and not Mattis himself, but one of his henchmen said, well, you know, actually there's a prison program you might be interested in. I said, prison program? Because I knew quite a bit about prisons because of my parole situation. He said, yeah. I said, do you mean like a chain gang? Because in the South, where I come from, they have chain gangs. It's kind of grisly. They have dogs and chain gangs. And he said, no, these are sort of New York chain gangs. So what that meant was, for a base, very small, relatively small amount of money, which was matched by another department, we had buses of criminals come to PS1. They weren't in chains at all. It was just more or less something to do, and they could get credit for it. But they were prisoners, and there were guards with them. There were guards. And what they did was they cleared a lot of the rubble and put it into these giant dumpsters. That went on for a couple of months. But I knew initially, without any problem whatsoever, I knew that the first show, which would be up a long, long time, was going to be about installation, because that's what you would do at a place like PS1, was installation. And this would be the home of all of our great installation artists. Now, installation is a huge umbrella to be under. So, of course, what I was doing at Tommy's was the artists were helping me refine what that really meant and how it could be served best at PS1 in one show. I was originally going to do the largest installation show in the world so far. We had Documenta by then. But Documenta was still at least 50%, if not more, painting. And not non-controversial, but not conservative, but a conventional sculpture, let's say, of a definition kind. So I was learning, you know, the various aspects of it. I made a decision, which was probably the wrong decision for the show, but it, for me, was the right decision at the time, but ultimately wrong one, which was to attempt to see what it would be like to put non-installation, i.e. painting, in the rooms show, in rooms prepared for that reason, not shiny, but whatever, and see how it looked. And the way it looked bad. These things happen in all big shows, but if I'd put more of the installation people I wanted to put in, and I was going to give each of the artists, there were going to be 100 people in the show, and each of them was going to get $100, which is had to cover getting their stuff there and getting it in. Now, 1976, that was very, very little money, but it was at least a real money. It would be like, say, $3,000 would be now. People like Richard Nonis and was really building something. Richard Serra went over very early because he was working on the roof in a place that you can't get to now. He was making a drawing in the cement floor that only certain of the arched, bizarre Byzantine windows that the light came into this extraordinary triangle room created by the roof on the floor and the windows. He made a drawing of a line, and then he sunk a small I-beam in the floor. Anyway, it was a very beautiful drawing, and he was experimenting with that. And Bruce Nauman also went on the roof, but he went above Richard Serra on a roof that was a flat roof, and there was a roofer's ladder which wasn't very well attached to the bricks. It was just so glorious. It was so glorious because I had always fought the feeling of permanence, thinking that temporary was a more respectable emotion to have regarding art. I actually I'm not really in favor of public art, permanent public art. Much of it's awful looking anyway. It's chosen by a committee and chosen by, you know, a committee trying to make a community happy. You know, it's just like some sort of strange camel with 15 humps in it. But anyway, if it's temporary, then I think that's good enough. And in addition, in everything that was done at PS1 the entire time I was director was called a temporary installation. Richard Serra's drawing is still there, but it's temporary. I'm talking about temporary distinguished from permanent because temporary also, it means not only can it go, but it will go. It will go when either party wants it. 49% of the person wants it to go, and the 51% of the person can take it away. And so that meant that the collection was not a collection which was going to be stable. But there were so many interesting works made that were loved so much during the room show that many of them are still there right now. When it opened in June, it really hit like a nuclear explosion because it's not that there had never been installations before, because it was a minimalist on. There had been all over in New York, especially in galleries, which wanted them. But they had never been under one roof. And my dream was that with PS1, we could put under one roof one big show. This is the only big show I was ever going to do like that, and with the exception of 4 other times, it's the only time I did it. But the second reason PS1 under one roof was an important, almost part of my catechism, was that in the future I could choose very different points of view that I found existing, in many cases antagonistic points of view, but have very good shows of those points of view in the same space at the same time. So the viewer would go through. The curatorial presence was largely throughout PS1 neutral. Walking through as a viewer, you didn't have catalogs because we could never print catalogs. We never had that money, nor did I care to do so. Often the labels had been written by the artist, so there was no strong overview being presented. You weren't being told what you were seeing, and you had to see it yourself. You had to distinguish it from the building itself, which could have been artwork. You had to watch out so you wouldn't fall in case there was something wrong with the building. And you had to look up so that nothing fell on you, because things continued to fall off the ceilings at unfortunate times, never hurting anyone, thank heavens. However, one of the good things was you didn't have to get up early in the morning to see PS1, because I made the museum keep the same hours I did. So we weren't open in the morning, we were hardly open in the day, and we were open in the evening. And that meant that a lot of people could come to PS1. And we were, right away, I gave up Saturday as a day. We were open Saturday afternoon, but I paid no attention to it. Sunday was our day. I looked at it as church. I said, for all of us, and this was a tribe, a huge tribe of people who lived in New York City, and with members of the tribe who would fly in or drive in constantly from out of town. And they were also members of the tribe. Our tribe, art was our church, art was our God, and you came on Sunday.
Artifacts is a free oral histories platform. Please like, subscribe, and visit our website, www.artifacts.movie, for an ad-free, interactive experience with bonus content. If you're able, please make a tax-deductible donation at www.artifacts.movie/donate. Hit the link on screen to watch another Artifacts interview.